This is man
Blog Talk
STL Strange
Radio.
Umar.
No.
All right.
Go.
This is man STL Stranger Umar Lee joining you live here from St. Louis, Missouri. And with us today we have a very special guest, Farrah Fazal. How are you today?
Mr. Umar, I am fine. Thanks so much for the honor of being on your podcast and for being able to talk to people in St. Louis again. As you know, I worked for several years in St. Louis, and I still consider it home. I've been to many places, and while I wasn't born there, I'm not a convert of the toasted ravioli and all the Ted Drews. I can do that all day.
Yeah.
I still think St. Louis is home.
All right. Well, I just got done watching your YouTube channel, a bunch of your old videos from St. Louis and
Goodness,
from other places. So I remember well. Now, where are you at today?
Well, I am traveling, so I have been since March on the border of Syria and Lebanon. And as we know, there has been a war going on in Syria. So many of the refugees who had to escape that war ended up on the border of Lebanon. So it's an area called the Bekaa Valley, which is just about a couple of miles literally from the border. And so I'm now on my way back to the U.S.
So the Syrian Civil War has been going on for several years, and obviously the refugee issue has become a big international issue, and with Trump's Muslim ban, it's at the forefront. I feel the Syrian Civil War is one of those things that Americans see briefly on the news. It's not covered all that in depth usually on national news, and there may not be a great interest in the American public. They just know something's going on over there. Why do you think Americans should be so concerned about what's going on with the Syrian Civil War and the refugee crisis?
Well, let me tell you how I first got to know the Syrian community. It was actually in St. Louis. For much of my career, Omar, I have covered refugees and immigrants. I worked on the U.S.-Mexico border, where many people were escaping Central America, the violence in Central America, and the gangs and the cartels and the drugs. And so they would come through that U.S.-Mexico border. And I worked across the country in St. Louis, in Omaha, in Minneapolis, in Florida, in Montana. And I can tell you that there are refugees and immigrants in every town, in every city in this country. They are our neighbors. They live down the street. They live around the corner. They are in government. They are business people. They work at our universities. So really, they are not this just big homogenous thing that are in a different country. And so when I was working in St. Louis, and you will probably remember this, there was a crisis, a Syrian crisis. Well, it's been going on for 7 years, the war, but there was an especially dangerous moment when Mayor Slay was the mayor of St. Louis. And people in the U.S. were very afraid that the Syrians who would come into this country would be terrorists. So not many cities were signing up to accept Syrian refugees. But the International Institute in St. Louis has been doing incredible work for years, as you know. And Mayor Slay decided that they were going to open the doors of St. Louis, and they were going to welcome these Syrian refugees into that community. And they did. And I remember going to the International Institute and meeting a family that had literally just dropped into St. Louis 2 days before. And they told me this horrific story. And they said, we were trying to escape the war with our children. They had 2 children, 2 young children, and they were parents. And they said all we could try to do is walk and run towards the Turkish border. So that, and I remember the mom saying, I could hear the gunfire, I could hear the airstrikes, I could hear the bombs, and I held my child, and I just ran as fast as I could to the border. They were able to get to safety on the Turkish side, and they were able to apply for refugee status, and they were assigned to come to St. Louis. They didn't even know anybody in St. Louis. And that was now several years ago, when I worked there. So frankly, we have to care because they are our people. They are people who we might know, who our friends might know, who our children go to school with, and they have a story to tell us that is really compelling. One of the things that, as you may know, I just in the last few years have done some substantive reporting internationally when I worked at KSTP-TV. And I have to tell you, many TV stations, local TV stations, do not do this and do not put the money aside. But KSTP-TV...
Right, that's a question I had. I remember seeing you in Somalia and, in the Horn of Africa, and I was like, man, I don't ever remember seeing this from a local news station. So that was kind of a unique thing.
It was unique. That station had, really made it a priority that we had in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have the highest numbers of East Africans, so Somalis, Eritreans, people from the Horn of Africa. Those are the highest numbers in these communities, and many of these people have families that are living in refugee camps in the Horn of Africa, and truly, that story was important because it's a local story, right? They try and send money to their families so that they can live. They try and help their families escape the famine and the war so that they can be free and be safe. So we wanted to find out, how were these families surviving across oceans? How were they able to communicate and be with each other? And it was really an incredible experience, Omar. I profiled this entire series of stories. It began with one little girl. Her name is Anfa, and she was 3 years old at the time. And her mother told me just before I went to do these stories in Africa that she had to leave her child behind, she said, because when she got refugee status, and remember, not everybody gets refugee status in the United States or anywhere else. 1% of all refugees in the world would get status somewhere. So Anfa's mother and father got refugee status in the United States, and they came to St. Cloud, Minnesota. And Anfa's mother just had given her birth. And the immigration officers told her that Anfa did not have refugee status, that she had two choices she could make. Either she could give up this refugee status, this dream of living freely without starvation, without war, and come to the United States, or she'd have to leave her child behind. Mm. And she made the decision to leave her child with her parents. So I went to find that child in a refugee camp in Kenya, the largest refugee camp in the world, called the Dadaab. And it's like a needle in a haystack. It was horrific being there. There are miles and miles of, it's like a caged land. All these people live on very dry, desolate areas where you cannot even grow something. And they starve, and they don't have water, and they have really not much of anything.
In Kenya is where most of the Somali refugees are coming to America from. They're not coming directly from Somalia. They're mostly coming from Kenya, correct?
Many of them left the war 25 years ago when Al-Shabaab took over the country in Somalia. They all actually walked to Dadaab, to Kenya. So it's true, many refugees did immigrate from that camp, and some refugees did come from Mogadishu and areas around Somalia. Ultimately, we found Anfa, and I remember this moment, Umar, that I think I will always remember for the rest of my life. I still keep in touch with Anfa and her mother, but this is a moment that was defining for me, and I hope it may help other people understand what it is like to not have your child. I had taken a video of Anfa's mother with me before I left for Kenya, and I just asked her mother to say a few words. I just recorded it on my phone, and I said, I'll show your daughter when I find her. I'll show her that you sent her a message. And on my phone, I had this video. And when I talked to Anfa, I said, Anfa, I have a message from your mommy. And I played the message on my phone. And Anfa looked intently on my phone and listened to her mother. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she did the most incredible thing. She leaned over and she kissed the phone. She kissed her mother. She, in that moment, it was so clear to me that this 3-year-old child just wanted to be with her mother. What is most interesting, and I think this maybe brings us a little closer to our current environment, and how many people feel about refugees and immigrants. After those stories aired, I thought this is a story of a mom and a child. So, maybe it transcends this issue of refugees and immigrants, because we can all relate to mothers who miss their babies, and we can all relate to babies who want to be with their mothers. That's something we can understand. Right. What I found is after those stories aired, an incredible outpouring in 2 ways. We did Facebook Lives for each of those 4 stories, and we had people from around the world. We were having audiences of 500,000 people meeting us on Facebook Live to talk about these stories and to talk about their own stories and why they mattered and why we came, and people from the refugee camps getting on Facebook Live to tell us and talk to us. So we had this outpouring of incredible connectivity. And then I had death threats, and I had people who wanted to kill me, and I had people who were extremely upset that I would go tell these stories. So on both ends of that, I think has taught me a lot about how to navigate these times that we live in. And I have really, in the last few years, decided that I'm, as a journalist, our jobs are to find truth. Facts matter in our world. Right. And so we are always constantly, that is our North Star. Our North Star is facts and truth. And I realized that there was a point that wasn't enough. And what could I do to connect with people who felt very, very strongly and believed what they really felt? Perception is reality.
Because in Minnesota, where you were working, that we have this huge Somali community. I mean, I was in Minneapolis, and I saw these kind of mini Somali strip malls, or actually shopping malls, and I went to Somali restaurants. It's just a big community there. But politically, there's also a climate of reactionary politics in Minnesota, of those that are not happy about the rising Somali population, or when they see a politician like Ilhan Omar and in hijab and in elected office. There is a climate that is not as friendly towards that Somali immigration. And so I guess your video series and your reporting from Kenya and Somalia was not something they were big fans of, I would guess.
I think it was extremely divided. And I went through every email, and I answered every email. I answered every call that came in. I answered when people were trying to connect with us on Facebook and other places. I tried to engage, and I think you're right that there's absolutely an increase in hate crimes against immigrants and refugees in Minnesota and around the country. There is an atmosphere of hate that has, perpetuated because of belief systems of people. But I want to give you a story that I believe counters that, and it requires actually journalists like me doing something a little differently. So let me tell you the story, and I hope it will help at least explain this hate. I actually, what you may not know is besides these large populations of immigrants and refugees in Minnesota, the only urban Indian reservation, if you will, inside a city is in Minneapolis.
I didn't know that.
So we have a sizable Native American population that lives in urban areas, that lives in, considered Section 8 housing, and has an entire community of people who talk to each other and who communicate with each other and who form bands with each other, and they're called the Little Earth Tribe. So we journalists are not very good at covering that particular community, because what happens is that there are and this will make sense to people in St. Louis. So, there's a shooting, and what do? We go and cover the shooting. Mm-hmm. It's usually gang related, so what do? We cover it. And I mean, ultimately it's sort of reactionary in that way. And I don't know that we always go back to find out what happened. So really quite by accident, I had decided before this incident happened that I was going to try to focus on that community, and I needed to try to get into that community, but it was very difficult. And here's why. Just by chance, one day I was covering a story of a police officer who patrolled that area who was accused of horrific crimes against little Native American children. And so I go to that community, and as we do what we do, right? We pull in, we're trying to take some video, and all of a sudden, as the photographer is taking some video, I hear these loud voices, and I step out of the car, and it's this young man with a phone, and he's yelling at my photographer, and he's saying to him, "Get the hell out! I'm Facebook Living this. You're not going to twist and turn this around. Get out of here! You can't be on this property." And I said, "Oh, hi. I'm Farrah. Can I talk to you?" And he said, "No, I'm Facebook Living you, and you get out." And he had some really quite choice words for me that I can't really repeat.
Right.
But he was hot, and he was angry, and he wanted us out. And I said, "Look, I understand, but can I talk to you? Can we just let me explain to you what I'm doing? And because it would be, I want your help." And he said, "No, you don't. You're going to twist this whole thing around. You don't ever tell our stories." And I said, "Well, okay, so let's do that now." And he said, "Well, you're not going to twist anything around because I'm Facebook Living this." I said, "Okay, great. Well, let's just Facebook Live it together then." And he said, "No, I want you to get out." So for 25 minutes, I engaged with him. His name was Lance. At the very end, Lance said to me, "Don't ever come back. Get out now and don't ever come back." And I said, "Well, let me give you my card. Here's my phone number. Here's my email. If you call me, I promise I'll call you back, but I need your help to tell the stories of your community." So 2 days later, I have to go to court for this officer who has, committed these crimes. And I'm waiting outside the courtroom, and who do you think is walking up outside that courtroom? Lance. And he's walking towards me, and he has a very serious expression on his face. And I'm getting ready for round 2. Leans up and he says, "I'm really sorry. I called you some really bad names. And I'm really sorry I did that because I saw some stories you did and they were okay." Okay, listen, in Lance's world, okay is really splendid. And I said, "Lance, what I've learned all along the way, all the great humanitarians have always said, it takes two people talking to each other to change. And he said, you people come to our community and you don't represent us. You don't tell our stories. You just want to come and cover the shooting, or you just want to come and, and there are reasons behind that shooting. And I said, that's true. So let's tonight tell a different story. And he sat beside me, and I said, you know what? We cannot even talk it to anybody in your community because people come, reporters come, and you want them out. So how about we find somebody today that represents your community? And he did. And Lance helped me that day. That day at 6 o'clock, we told the story of that community, with that community, of that community, from somebody with that community. And at 6 o'clock, 6:05, I got a text from Lance. And he said, you told our story. Subsequently, in the months after, Lance and I did a lot of work together. Lance and his crew actually have started the Natives Against Heroin because there's a huge opioid problem, huge heroin problem. A lot of Native American people are succumbing to this. They don't have resources. They don't have the ability to get help. And they just, it's down the rabbit hole. But Lance and his friends go street by street to pick up needles. They're doing so much outreach. They got a grant from the city. These stories are never told, right? You don't see those on TV. And we told those stories. And it made a difference in that community when we could. So I think that thanks for bearing with that story. It was really long. But what I can tell you that I took away from that is until we start engaging with people who don't necessarily want to engage with us, unless we try to meet them where they are, unless we try to form connections and trust with them and be reflective of who they are, we can't. We are divided. People are tribalistic in this country. But unless we hear them and why they feel that way, there's no way for us to talk to each other. When I left Minneapolis, Lance and the community of Natives Against Heroin prayed for me and had a smudge ceremony because they realized I was going to a war zone. I cannot tell you how much that means as a journalist to know that they felt that their stories were told, that they felt strongly enough that they would want to give me such a precious gift. But I think this is something we can all do. Journalists can certainly do that, but we can do this with our neighbors, right? Our neighbor might be somebody who has a different opinion than us, but unless we talk to people, how are we ever going to be able to come to some common ground?
Yeah, well, we don't have a lot of that going on these days. Now, let's. Now you're in Lebanon near the Syrian border, and that's today. We know the situation there. It's a tough situation. It's you could talk for hours just about the Syrian conflict, what's going on, but I want to back it up a little bit before you got into your career in journalism. Because you've been all around the world, you've been all over the United States. Did you grow up in the States, or?
I did not. I was born in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in Africa. When I was 7 years old, my parents decided, who were, by the way, not rich people, but they decided that the most important thing is that they needed to get me an education. And if I could get an education in a developing country, I couldn't get one in a developing country, so they decided they needed to do whatever it took to send me somewhere where I could get an education, because they felt that if I could get one, I would forever be able to take care of myself. I would be able to contribute to the world. And they were people who, my parents were people who believed deeply in service and serving your family and your neighbors and your community, and using what you had to serve. So they felt that the way to do that was to get me an education. So they sent me to London. So I did all my early schooling in London. And then I went to Canada, and I did all my high school and post-secondary in Canada. And then
what
I
part
immigrated.
of Canada?
Calgary, Canada.
Calgary. All right.
Alberta. Mm-hmm.
Calgary, Alberta.
I started my career when I was 16 years old. I walked into a public access station and said, "Hey, well, this is public access, and I'm the public, and I need to access the station because you're not telling stories of people like me."
In Calgary, you do this?
In Calgary.
Yeah, so you're talking about curling or something?
Some smart-ass 16-year-old comes to your TV station and says, "Hey, I'm like the public, and I want to access the public access station." Right. I mean, I don't know why they just didn't kick me out, but they didn't. And so I at 16, I had a little TV show on public access, and it was really about people my age and how do we and it was teenagers, not necessarily teenagers of color, but teenagers in Calgary. I eventually landed jobs in commercial television, and I.
Well, what about journalism though? I mean, what specifically?
Why did I? So that's a great question, and thank you for asking. When I was 7 years old, I was sitting on my uncle's couch in London. And I remember watching the BBC, and I remember this big explosion, this bomb that had gone off. And I remember the 7-year-old boy on the TV who was talking to the reporter. And he had lost his entire family in this explosion, in this bomb, in the war zone. And he kept saying, "I don't have anybody, and I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm all alone in the world." And as he was talking to this reporter, who was very compassionately trying to tell his story, I kept thinking to myself, "But I'm his age, and I have parents who love me, and and I know I'm safe. I think everybody needs to hear his story." And I said to my uncle, Uncle, I need to tell his story to everybody I know. And it was the idea of being able to tell stories, and his story and other stories, that really, I didn't know at the time that it was called journalism, but I just knew that I needed to tell stories, and it became the driving force for me. And so telling the stories of people, all people on all sides of the spectrum. I have told stories of white supremacists who sat down and talked to me. I've interviewed cartel members. I've interviewed a terrorist. I've interviewed children who are refugees of war. And I think that has been a driving factor for me, the ability to be able to see somebody's story and want other people to open the windows and their minds, and the ability to be able to understand, maybe put ourselves for a second in somebody else's shoes.
Let me ask you this question. Dar es Salaam is a very unique place in the world. It's a very diverse place, as you know better than I do. Arab culture, South Asian culture, East African culture, etc. It's a very cosmopolitan place in many senses. Do you think that affected your interest and your ability to learn about others coming from such a place that was diverse in nature itself?
Interestingly enough, it is extremely diverse, and you're so right about that. You really painted a really accurate picture of my hometown. What was really the other part of that diversity was that our best friends, my parents' best friends, were people who we lived in the not so rich part of town. But there were people who lived in Oyster Bay, the very rich part of town, who were Germans. And Hans and Greta were their names. And they would come to my house, and they would come to see me because they really were fascinated by my parents and my parents' children, me and my brother and my sister. And so they would come and integrate with us and be part of our family. And so I had an interesting window into a lot of different kinds of people. There are people who worked with my parents to take care of us, and one of them was a Muslim woman named Asha. And so Asha and I spent a lot of time with Asha. She was kind of like my nanny. And so I got to understand and know her as almost like a parent. I started speaking, my parents insisted that I learn other languages. So I spoke Swahili for a while with Asha. I spoke different languages to my parents, and they hired a tutor from Goa, Portuguese woman, to teach me English. So I was very lucky that my parents felt that the more they could expose me to all kinds of people, all levels of income, all kinds of viewpoints, that would really only help me. And so I think that did make a difference, that even though they weren't thinking, like down the line, you're going to be a better human being. They were just thinking, you need to understand compassion for people. And by being compassionate to Asha and her life, and understanding Hans and Greta and their life, and knowing the tutor and her life, that you would become a kinder human being. And so I think ultimately that did affect my ability to be able to travel in some circles. But ultimately, when you're a kid, your parents are your dividing and guiding lights.
Right.
And so they were the people that I felt safest with. I think ultimately when I was 7 years old and had to be away from them, because they sent me alone, and I went to boarding school.
Right.
Catholic boarding school. So
in the UK.
And I got to meet. So I could, I understand the Bible. I understand the novena. I have prayed the novena. And I don't even know what the novena is. What is that, a Catholic prayer or something? So if you're a Muslim, you'll understand what the salawat is. Right. It's the most powerful prayer for Catholics. Okay. And so I then began to have exposure to different religions, because I saw different children in this, this boarding in this boarding school. So I think that their ability to be able to allow their child to leave in pursuit of this education was integral in my upbringing.
So fast forward, you get to St. Louis. What year did you get to St. Louis?
I was in St. Louis in 2013. I had just actually finished a fellowship. I was working on the U.S.-Mexico border for several years. I got an opportunity. 8 of us journalists from around the country were chosen to do a fellowship in Pakistan. So I went to Pakistan to do this fellowship, and it was part of a State Department, the U.S. State Department program as well. We got to meet high levels of governmental people in Pakistan. We got a deep background briefing from the U.S. State Department. We got to really experience life in Pakistan and understand the political situation, the real life situation. At the time, the Taliban was, when I went, was extremely active. So our first initiation into Pakistan was in Karachi, and 2 blocks from my hotel.
What year
there
was
a bomb that went off. 2013.
2013, okay.
And we understood where we were, us journalists. And so I was very lucky to be able to have that experience. And as soon as I came back from Pakistan, actually I shot some stories for KSDK, and they aired on KSDK from Pakistan. And then I began my work here, in St. Louis.
So when you get to St. Louis, what was your initial impression of St. Louis? You've been around the world, and you get to St. Louis. what really, grabbed you about St. Louis?
I had been to St. Louis in one previous tour of duty. So, when I came to St. Louis, I came as an investigative reporter. I worked on the investigative team with Mike Rush and Lisa Zigman at KSDK. But I had been to St. Louis and worked at the Fox station a few years before in the Fox Files, in the investigative unit there, before I'd left actually to go to Omaha, Nebraska. So I had been to St. Louis. And it's really interesting because I think combining those experiences, my initial perspective of St. Louis when I first came was that I wasn't sure where the fit would be. I did not. So if you asked me where I went to high school, I would not have an answer for you because I didn't come from St. Louis.
Because I tell people I'll ask you, and I don't care if you're from St. Louis or not. I get to learn about another high school in another state.
High school, right? James Fowler, by the way. So
all right, there we go.
I thought, well, I don't know what to quite do with this. But what I did understand very clearly is that it was a very black and white city.
Right.
And I felt, and it's interesting because of all of the places I have been, as you know, Omar, I was on the ground in Ferguson before Ferguson happened, during Ferguson, and after Ferguson. So it was a time in our history that I find to be integral to my experience. But I think initially I understood St. Louis a little differently in those concepts. When I came back to St. Louis as an investigative reporter, it felt like coming home, interestingly enough. And I don't know why, there was this incredible charm about this very black and white city. But as I worked in St. Louis in my second coming, if you will, I began to see a diversity. I began to see the mosaic of St. Louis expanding. Just because we don't always see the gray doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so when I got back to St. Louis, I didn't know, truly to be honest, I had other offers that were, shall we say, more lucrative, that might have been better opportunities. But I felt really drawn to come to St. Louis, and I understood why when Ferguson happened. I felt it was my calling to cover that story, and I felt that when I got on the ground in St. Louis, I had really started trying to develop relationships in the gray, in the communities that felt disenfranchised, that didn't feel heard. There's a size. We have the biggest, Bosnian community in the country.
Right.
And how many people know that when you walk down Sarajevo, there is an entire dedication to St. Louis on the main street in Sarajevo? How many people know that? Right. But there's this connectivity.
Yeah. Look, we're the big hub for the Bosnians, in South City, South County. But I remember when the Somalis, they came at the same time the Bosnians did. I remember working with Muslim Social Services in the early 90s, and we were helping to settle them down on Hickory Street to the south of downtown St. Louis.
Wow.
We talk about Syria. The first Syrian opposition members I ever met were in St. Louis.
Wow.
One time I was walking down the streets in Jerusalem, and a guy runs up to me. He owns a little shop in the old city, and he gives me a gift. And he says, I see you walking down the street in St. Louis all the time in front of my store. So
oh, my goodness.
The world is, look, another story is, every year at Hajj, there's over 2 million people. And I got two friends of mine from St. Louis. They both went. They didn't know the other person was going. You know, they're making tawaf around the Kaaba in the middle of the night, and they see each other from St. Louis. You know?
Oh, wow.
You know,
it's a small world.
So
they were much more.
The world is small. I mean, St. Louis is black and white. There's no question about it. But there is that it's not exclusively. There is a lot of communities out of St. Louis that a lot of people don't know about. They may not get covered the way they should, but things are changing slowly but surely, even in St. Louis.
I remember meeting Bruce Franks Jr. during Ferguson. And he was a protester, and he was getting arrested, and I remember covering him. It was really interesting because, you know, before Bruce Franks became Representative Bruce Franks Jr.,
right.
Most people don't know, you know, how active he really was in that movement. And I think that, you know, that appreciation has happened, to be completely honest. But I don't think that they knew his intricate ability to be able to be a bridge maker. And one of the stories, I think at that moment we were the only people to do this story, because Bruce told me that his new best friend was a police chief of St. Louis City, and I said, Bruce, are you putting me on? You're telling me you communicate with the police chief of St. Louis City every day? He said, yeah, he's my best friend, man. And we did that story of how a protester in Ferguson walked in to the police chief's office and said, hey, I'm here to talk to you about this injustice. And the next thing you know, he's the next best friend. And these two people decided that they were going to work together. And it was, you know, these are the stories that I think we often miss because we don't get into those communities to talk to those people. And so I think you're absolutely right. St. Louis is changing and has changed and always was changing. We just didn't always see it. And I think ultimately I feel very protective about St. Louis because I think so many ways perception is reality. When you end up on the number 2 list of the most murders in the country or whatever is the case, that's what people see. But that is not what St. Louis is. You know, there is an entire tech community that is going on on Washington, Avenue in St. Louis. There's an incredible medical community. You are graduating some of the best lawyers in the country in Washington University. There's a movement of protesters and activists who are making big strides into government, who've become, change makers. So it's a story of St. Louis that is a tale of two cities in a sense, isn't it? And I think that is the case really in a lot of cities. And I think until we can understand some of the layers of wherever it is that you live, wherever you're listening to this podcast, it's happening in your city, whether it's in North Carolina or Missouri or Minnesota or Florida. There are nuances happening everywhere. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is every city is a tale of two cities. I mean, that's the way the economy is structured. In America, you're going to have a prosperous group of people, and you're going to have people that are not prosperous. I think the difference is, I've lived around the country. Grew up in St. Louis, came back. That one of the differences between here and Dallas, where I'm spending a lot of time, is Dallas, you have the same dynamic, but the economy is a lot more vibrant. There's a lot more jobs. Mm-hmm. So even if you're poor, even if you don't have a lot of money, you still have more access to more stuff than in St. Louis, which you have kind of a shrinking economy. And it's really tough for for people to get from one point in life to the other. With the limited opportunities. That's one of the issues that people in St. Louis are dealing with. And I think I told people in Ferguson, look, the North County of my childhood has lost 100,000 jobs. Okay,
Yeah.
And so that was a part of the story that really wasn't getting told, was that, there was a lot of economic factors in play as well as generational factors in play. And backing up to Syria and Lebanon, and you mentioned Mayor Slay, of course, his family came from that area. And,
that's right.
And so there had always been people coming, from other countries, other cultures to St. Louis to build a life for themselves and their families. And the Lebanese-Syrian faction, as they were called, were historically very influential in St. Louis politics and civic life. Now, you're there now. What is the mood now? Because it appears to the outside that the war is still going on, but it's winding down somewhat, that the threat of the government collapsing is no longer there because they've been kind of shored up by the Russians, et cetera, and that Bashar al-Assad will stay in power. What is the mood in that area now? Are people just kind of war weary, or are they just apprehensive about the next stage, or just happy to be alive at this point?
I was on the ground 2 miles from the Syrian border on April 14th when President Trump ordered airstrikes along with the allies in Syria for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's attempt to use Syrian chemical weapons on Syrian people and to destroy those chemical weapons. I asked the refugees that I was around, and I said, this is happening right now. We're hearing the airplanes in the air, and actually had that escalated, we would have been in the middle of the war on our side in Lebanon. And they said to me, well, really, it's a little too late. You care now about us? The Syrian people have felt forgotten for 7 years. This has been going on for 7 years. And and I don't think most people know how the Syrian war started. Just briefly, there were, protesters who were protesting the government restrictions and the dictatorial, authoritarian attempts by the government to change Syrian life. So there were, young men and women, university kids protesting these efforts, and the Syrian government's attempt to wipe out those protests began the Syrian war, and it has escalated. People told me horrific stories of having survived chemical attacks, of being tortured. A man told me that he was just driving his taxi, and he was stopped. The people in uniforms took him somewhere, and he did nowhere, and he was in very dark places for he doesn't know how long, and he was told that he was sick, and then they removed his kidney. There's torture that's happening in Syria that has been well documented and well written about. The independent agency that assesses whether chemical attacks have happened or not has determined that chemical attacks have happened in Khan el-Shakun and in other places, in Idlib and in Ghouta. So this is the landscape that the people from Syria left, and this is the landscape that they have to go back to. There are men that are not going back into Syria, even though the war is winding down. It's mostly children and women. And the reason is because if men go back, young men, young boys, they'll be conscripted into the Syrian army. And when you're in the Syrian army, your job is to kill people. So, ultimately, this is the United Nations has said this is not safe. Just a week ago, you had people escaping Daraa, living in the desert, starving and not having access to clean water, and dying from bites of spiders and tarantulas.
Right. Right.
So this is not safe for them to go back to, but they don't have any choice. They feel that the world has forgotten and abandoned them. Nobody's opening the doors.
Yeah, I mean, it's so complex. I mean, you obviously have the international players that are playing their politics in Syria. The Iranians, Russia, the Saudis, the Turks, et cetera. They all have their game that they played in consular, the game they played in Syria. The obviously with the opposition, one of the biggest issues is, it fragmented so much into hundreds of different groups. Many, international people coming in, with, fighters with Nusra and, these Daesh and these other groups that had a negative influence, and then the Kurds, that whole dynamic, and then,
there's no doubt that ISIS and Al Qaeda are on the ground, mixing with regular innocent people. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, and many of them are from Europe and from North Africa and from Saudis, et cetera. And then you have the pro regime that brought in fighters from Pakistan and Lebanon and Iraq and Iran, et cetera, to bolster their position. So it really just became an international killing ground where people from all over with sectarian differences or political differences came and went to war with each other, and the people really suffered.
And exactly right. And that is, I think, ultimately, covering wars, that for me is the most important piece of that often gets lost in the mechanics of all of these complexities are the innocent people. You know what, Umar, the people who I met, and the refugees who I met, both in Syria and Lebanon, 70% of them are children. They are children who are dying, children who are starving, children who are not going to school. In Lebanon, they are not considered, the Syrian refugees who are living on that border are not considered human beings. They have no access to any services, any food, and United Nations is not allowed to set up any sort of structure for them. They are forgotten people, the refugees of war, and so they become the casualties, in essence, of all of these complicated political situations that are happening, where everybody has a horse in the game. Who doesn't have a horse in the game are the innocent people who are caught in between all of this. And ultimately, my job I've tried hard to tell the stories of those people, where they've come from, everybody cares about home. You care about your little piece of safety that you don't have. You care that, your children are safe, that they're able to go to school. And so, in the complex political environment of Syria, the stories of people who are running and who now have to probably go back to the situation that is not much better than they left.
And the great thing in Lebanon has been that, because Lebanon has civil war and civil conflict and a fragile political situation even still today. The great fear was that the civil war was going to spill into Lebanon. It looks like that's not going to happen. So they died.
Yeah, I think that's going to happen.
You think it is going to happen?
But Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey have really taken a lot of refugees. At one point, 1.3 million ended up in Jordan, and little over 1 million ended up in Lebanon. So it's not, on the other hand, you can kind of understand these countries who have had to absorb these refugees. But international law mandates, when people are refugees of war, that there is a parameter for them to seek asylum somewhere. Ultimately, the United Nations has said to countries like Lebanon, these are refugees of war, and so they deserve some level of access to medical care. I met. There were children who I actually embedded with a group called Syrian American Medical Society, which I think you have a chapter in St. Louis. These are doctors, medical professionals who went for a short amount of time, who came to the border in Baka and tried to help people. And I remember this one little boy, Azam. His parents brought him in. He was 8 months old. He was the most beautiful child. He couldn't breathe. The doctors who were there, highly trained doctors, didn't have much, they didn't have an oxygen that they could give him. And so they sent him to the nearest hospital. The hospital, and they said to that hospital, if this boy doesn't get oxygen, he's going to die tonight. The parents went to that hospital about 30 minutes away. Hospital turned them away. They came back to that clinic. And I, through some real heroic efforts on the Syrian American Medical Society's part, they were able to get some money together and send that child before the end of the night back to that hospital. And he survived. But imagine all the children that didn't and won't. So they're ultimately these refugees end up. I understand, being a burden on countries where they end up, but they don't want to be. They want to work. In Lebanon, they're not allowed to work. They cannot even do menial jobs. The law is that if you're a Syrian refugee, you've just escaped there, you cannot work. You don't have access to any medicine, food, services, school. Children cannot go to Lebanese school. So, there's quite a dynamic of opposites here. And I think the story of the Syrians is the story of the Bosnians. It wasn't just that long ago that the Bosnians were escaping genocide. It wasn't so long ago that the Somalis were escaping al-Shabaab. It is a story of refugees of all communities, and that's what I think is hardest for people to understand, because they don't get the background.
In particular, if you look at the Somali example in Kenya, and you look at the other examples, the Pashtuns and the provinces of Pakistan and other situations where you have generationally kids growing up as refugees, history has told us that's a real bad recipe, because you're going to have a lot of angry youth growing up in this situation. So, I think when you look at Syria, I don't think you have a total resolution for decades, because you have a whole generation now that's grown up with the bombing and the parents being killed and displacement, no education. There's going to be a blowback from that. There's going to be a blowback.
The United States, the United States has understood this in our time in Africa, in Mogadishu, in Somalia. In fact, when I was on the ground there, we did a story on called Boots on the Ground, Americans, doing a shadow war in essence in Somalia. And the reason why American soldiers are there is, in fact, I talked to a general who served as a commander in Africa, who is now the head of the Minnesota National Guard, and he said to me, "Look, when these little children are starving, either we can get to them and we can be their friends and we can show them that there's a different way and we can give them food, or the terrorists will. And when the terrorists give them food, they recruit them. They make them haters of America and other Western countries. So it is in our interest, when we get on the ground in these countries, to do the outreach, to be, the lights of democracy. Because when we can show children who Americans are and why we're there and why we're fighting for them and why we want them to be safe, ultimately that's what they're going to grow up thinking. But if your representation is al-Shabaab, and al-Shabaab is heavily recruiting, not only in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, but around I've done dozens of stories in Minnesota. Al-Shabaab is reaching across social media lines to recruit children in Minnesota. And children in Minnesota have gone to Africa to fight for al-Shabaab and ISIS. It's not just something that's happening on the other side of the world.
We had and we had a couple Bosnians from St. Louis go to Syria too. So I mean, it's an international phenomenon. But before I got to wrap it up, I want to ask you, because Americans were narcissistic people, we're self-centered. We don't watch a lot of international news. We don't know a lot about. I mean, I want to exclude myself because I do watch a lot and read a lot, but most don't. And most look at world politics through an American lens. Through Republicans, Democrats, this red, blue, blood, crip American political system that we have. Mm-hmm. So today in Lebanon, United States of America, Donald Trump, how would you generally describe the view towards America right now?
I am an American. I am proud to be an American. I have dual citizenship, actually. I'm also a Canadian, and I'm proud to be a Canadian.
Right.
And I have to say that as a proud American, it hurts when I hear people not seeing America as the shining city on the hill, as President Reagan described us, not one of the 1,000 points of light, as President Bush described our community of America. There is a really it's an antagonistic and almost, I hear a lot of sadness from people. I hear a lot of anger. I hear devastation and frustration. And I hear surprise and shock. Country that they thought is, the savior of democracy and freedom and liberty, where the written words are "give me your huddled masses." I mean, this is the country that they think is the light of the world, and I hear people having a very different sense of America now, and I hear a duality in that. I hear people not giving up hope that is exactly what America is, and they don't express that of Americans, actually. That's been kind of interesting. While they see the president, incites some very strong emotions in people on both ends of the political spectrum, and really incites some very strong emotions from people on the other side of the world, as we're seeing right now and today. The president is traveling in Europe, and
right.
There are 100,000 people, more than 100,000 people marching in London because they are protesting the president's visit. So, but there are die-hard supporters of the president who believe that he is doing the right things for America. So I think what the side that Americans might not hear is the sadness of people on the other side of the world, that this country that they had come to so glorify and admire may not be what they thought it was, but they're not giving up thinking that it cannot be that. So I think ultimately, they understand that right now America does not want refugees and immigrants. That's what they think. They believe that will change at some moment, because refugees and immigrants, and even the Prime Minister of the UK has said that the United Kingdom has accepted many refugees and immigrants, and they have contributed to life in the United Kingdom. The issue is not immigrants and refugees. They have just become the easy targets. Everybody understands, including refugees, immigrants, and citizens of other countries, that countries have to have borders, that countries have to enforce the ability to be able to make borders safer. How do we do that in humane, compassionate ways? Frankly, that has happened in America. America has done that in humane, compassionate ways in our history. So I think what they're hoping, people on the other side of the world, is that the light that is America maybe a little dim right now, but they hope that it will shine again, because it must, because things don't stay the same. Things will have to change at some point. And maybe they hope that their fellow citizens of the world, the Americans, will see that they are not the enemy, people on the other side of the world, that they care about America just as much, and America's independence and America's freedom and America's potential and promise just as much as Americans do. Just at this moment, they don't see the welcome sign, and they don't see the acceptance. And I think that is a source of great sadness for people whom I meet around the world.
I got to wrap it up now. It's been good talking to you. I just want to, before we leave, just 2 points. Number one, everyone be sure to continue to support us on Patreon. St. Louis Speaks Podcast, what we're doing in the community. We can't do it without your support, so be sure to visit the Patreon page. And second, for the next time you're in St. Louis, they call me the proselytizer of Provel. I have to sell you on St. Louis style pizza, and that is really going to be a blessing once you are sold on St. Louis style pizza. Your life will never quite be the same. So it's been a pleasure talking to you.
You won't have to do a very hard job. So, I say, if I may, thank you so much for allowing me the idea and the ability to be able to speak to my fellow St. Louisans, and to you, thank you for helping me tell my story.
You're welcome, and good luck and stay safe in Lebanon and Syria. Thank you.
Thank you. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Omar, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
You give a wrap up of the show?
I did on the. Yeah, I did on the. I winded it down. I gave a Patreon plug.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
We're done.
Okay. All right.
Oh, shit.
What does your morning sound like?
Rock-a-bye, baby.
Is she asleep?
Yeah, finally.
Great. I picked up our favorite breakfast sandwiches from McDonald's.
Ooh. Oh.
My turn.
Here's to making your morning routine a little better. Right now, mix and match 2 select breakfast sandwiches, like a bacon, egg, and cheese McGriddles, a sausage McMuffin with egg, or a bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit for just $4. Breakfast at McDonald's. Single item at regular price. At participating McDonald's for a limited time.